Good evening, everybody. I'm happy to see you here, and I know that you're happy to be here listening to Gordon. It's always a pleasure to introduce Gordon Orians. Other residents here volunteer to be on a committee sometime, and Gordon offers to be a speaker again and again, and we really appreciate that. He's as you know, the credentials you always have to share. Gordon is a professor emeritus from University of Washington, professor of ornithology and ecology and a lot of related things. And he's a favorite friend and a good speaker here for us at Horizon House.
Thank you, Jane. I'm always amazed that people clap before they've heard anything, but thank you. I think it's an expression of hope. What you're seeing is there is a picture of the northern spotted owl, which is the most important way that the Endangered Species Act expressed itself in the Pacific Northwest. And I happen to be in court with respect to that, so I know a lot about it, and we'll return to that at the end. But meanwhile, we have a lot of ground to cover. The Endangered Species Act was the culmination of stuff. Several decades earlier, we had the Migratory Bird Act, which was between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and people were recognizing that birds were flying back and forth, and if we were to deal with that, you needed to look beyond the borders because the birds didn't know anything about those borders. But in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was the culmination of a whole bunch of things thinking about our relationship to the other species that share the world with us. And it is indeed a landmark legislation. And it passed in the Senate unanimously, and there were 6 negative votes in the House. Can you imagine anything passing with that kind of, and as I'll point out, unfortunately, this may be one of the rare instances when Congress didn't know exactly what it was talking about, but we'll deal with that. But I would just like to read what the president signing the Endangered Species Act said, and here's the quote. "Nothing is more priceless and more worthy of preservation than the rich array of animal life with which our country has been blessed. It is a many-faceted treasure of values to scholars, scientists, and nature lovers alike, and forms a vital part of the heritage we all share as Americans." And then talking about countless future generations, their lives will be richer and America will be more beautiful in the years ahead. Thanks to the measure that I have the pleasure to sign today. And who was that president? Richard Nixon. And he signed not only the Endangered Species Act, but all the major environmental legislation that was going on. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's behind the structure of the way the Act is. I'll tell you a little bit about it because the Act has an interesting structure. And we have 6 species of North Pacific salmon. According to the Endangered Species Act, there may be hundreds. So what's going on? How does it define a species? And why does it do it that way? So in order to understand that, I have to go back a little bit and say, well, what is a species? And how do species form? We had periods of time. When life first began, there was probably maybe 1 or 2 species, and then there have been millions formed, and there have been millions of extinctions in the past. So species have come and gone, and they continue to come and gone. But what is a species, and how do we think about it? And what is incorporated in the Endangered Species Act is a particular view. So the way modern biologists define a species, is a collection of individuals that are reproductively united and share among one another, but are reproductively isolated from other such groups, so that they are an evolutionary unit. They're evolving not in isolation because they're around everybody else, but they are an independent evolutionary unit. And so this is a strictly evolutionary definition of a species. And that is why the Endangered Species Act allows to be considered as species, according to the Act, any identifiable distinct subpopulation. Now, why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, this gets into how, in fact, do new species form. There have been what is the process of speciation? Darwin called his book The Origin of Species, but he said absolutely nothing about that. And as a matter of fact, it's very, very recent when we now talk about speciation, how do species form. And one way is simply something goes along, and Homo erectus never went extinct. It changed enough. Finally, we said, yeah, we better give it a different name. So it became Homo sapiens, but nothing went extinct. Okay, just we got a different name. But that's not how it really happens. What we really want to know in speciation is how we have one species, and it now undergoes processes, and there are now two or more. And how does this happen? And how it happens depends a lot on the kind of organism you're talking about. For plants, it's very, very different. And plants are included in the Endangered Species Act now. They got in. So that you would have the old Furbish lousewort stopping a dam. Ooh. But anyway, plants, you can get speciation immediately in one generation because, as you know, I'm looking at a bunch of diploids. We each are diploids. We got two sets of chromosomes, one we got from mom and one we got from papa. And when we undergo reproduction, the sex cells have half the number of chromosomes. And so when we go back and form it again, we get diploid again. So two sets. But plants often speciate by failure for that reduction to occur, and you'll get a tetraploid. And that tetraploid population is immediately isolated. It can't interbreed with anything else. And so you can get changes in chromosome number can occur in one generation, immediately isolated, and plants can then self-reproduce. And speciation by multiple generations, creation of more species, more genes is very common in plants, and so it's and we make a lot of use of that. Our common bread wheat is hexaploid, 6 copies, and we do that a lot. But that's not how it goes, with very, very rare exception, in animals. It's going to take a while, and it's going to involve space, so that the populations will spread out, and there will be isolation here and there, and not much gene exchange. And so that these separate populations slowly evolve differences. And they may evolve enough differences that when they come back together, they don't like one another, they don't mate, and they're reproductively isolated. Or on the other hand, they may come back and they're not that different, they get amalgamated and it goes away. So that's the process that's going on. So these isolated subpopulations, that is the process of speciation taking place. And that's why the Endangered Species Act identifies those as species. These are potentials. This is tracking the process by which this all happens. And most of them don't end up being new species, but some do. And the question is, we don't know which are which. So let's give them all a name. And so that's why in the Endangered Species Act, identifiable subpopulations are, by the definition of the Act, they are species. And this may seem like they're just generating a lot of trouble, but that's an important recognition. It is embracing how species actually form in most animals. And so we are tracking, and so we'll see when I come back at the end to the northern spotted owl. Well, this is one subspecies of spotted owls in North America, and we'll talk about what's going on and why that's important. So it's important to recognize then that the people who wrote the Endangered Species Act, which were scientists and attorneys, environmental attorneys, really understood the process and built into the process an understanding of evolution. So it's an evolutionary based unit. Now, what else does the Act do? It requires that a species may have to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And there are two agencies for the terrestrial and freshwater stuff. The Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for that, and Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for the marine species. Also at the same time in 1973, a big international Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the same year in 1973, and it deals with international stuff. The United States is a signatory to CITES, as it's called, and species get listed as endangered under CITES, and the United States has a rule that we're not allowed to import into the United States any species that's listed as endangered under CITES. And so the CITES are mostly sharks and tuna and parrots and orchids, international stuff that surprising what gets on there. So anyway, the Endangered Species Act, then there has to be a determination that the species is really endangered. That is, it's in danger of becoming extinct in the not too distant future unless we do something to protect it. The Endangered Species Act then also requires the agency, whichever one it is, to identify what the threat is, why it is endangered, and then to develop a recovery plan. What are we going to do to reduce that threat so that the population can be brought back to some level? And then there's identification. At this point, it will be back to the point when we can delist it. So the idea is to be able eventually to delist by bringing it back. But it's interesting, the politics gets in, that people are worried if you delist it, it's going to get bad again. And so there have been a lot of politics around delisting, and should we really delist or not. But we don't need to go there. So there's a process, and citizens, the Fish and Wildlife Service is understandably not too keen on doing this. It requires a lot of work. They're given this responsibility and no budget to do it, and making a determination and following up requires a lot of resources, and they'd rather be spending those resources on some other stuff. And often, but they can sometimes be forced. Citizens can sue, and this is how some of the listings have had. Citizen groups have sued. This species is obviously endangered, and you haven't listed it, and they have won. And so sometimes they've been forced to do that. But it's a very complicated process, and it takes, because you got to work, you got to identify what's going on. Why is it endangered? What's causing it? How are you going to alleviate that? What do you have to do? So this is not a simple process, and it has to be monitored. And so naturally, the Fish and Wildlife Service would rather often do something else. So it's obvious, as I said, Congress, in this rare moment, may not have really understood what it was doing. That I doubt that I can't imagine that the vast majority of people there have never read it. But what they were thinking about were bald eagles, peregrine falcons. So they weren't thinking about what actually came. And what was the first species? It was called a little pup fish, living in deep wells in the Mojave Desert. And the story was the Mojave Desert during the Pleistocene was a lot wetter, and there were a lot of species, and the spots shrunk, and finally you ended up with some little pup fish in a little deep wells, and that's the only place they are. and anything that would threaten the water would be endangering them. And a developer in the area there wanted to buy up the land and develop a big housing stuff, and was going to require all the water, and it was going to, that would drain the little deep hole where the pupfish was. The Endangered Species Act also called for the possibility, what's got to be known as the God Swad. That when you had something like this, and it looked like you were going to disrupt something really important for a little fish, little pupfish, they called it God Squad. First time it was employed. And to everyone's amazement, at least to mine included, but I think everybody, the God Squad came down on the side of the fish. But the way this all ended is the Nature Conservancy bought the land and put an easement on it and solved it all, so it's there. And you can go see the desert pupfish now. You got to climb down there in the deep where it is. The Nature Conservancy came to the rescue. But the other big one that came at first was another fish called a snail darter, about this big. It was in the Tennessee Valley. And the Tellico Dam was going to be authorized. They wanted to build a Tellico Dam. And that was going to flood the only known habitat for this little fish. And everybody was up in arms. You're going to stop a dam. Now, well, let me say something about that dam. The Army Corps of Engineers had never seen a free-flowing river they didn't want a dam. It's sort of unfinished business, you know. Got to get it, and that dam had no power. It was an open place that was going to generate any power. It was supposed to create a recreational place for people to get along, and that was how it is. That was supposed to be. It's stupid. The fish should have stopped it, which it ended up not doing because it was a dumb thing to do. But the Army Corps of Engineers also has found out that there's no place that wants to build a dam that it can't be justified as economic. And I had a good friend in the economics department. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Who made it his business to analyze all these analyses that the Corps of Engineers made to say this was valuable. This was going to be economic, and they did really amazingly voodoo economics to justify that. There wasn't any place they could think of putting a dam that wasn't going to be beneficial, and really, this one has not been. It should have been stopped. But what happened with the little snail darter? They looked around like crazy, and found out there were a few other places that it was, and the dam went in, and we still have the little snail darter. So, what happened? You see, is that what was going on were species that nobody had thought about, and when the Congress didn't have anything like that in mind. And then there was a little thing called the Furbish lousewort. It had a very narrow little distribution along a river in northern Maine, and they wanted to dam it. And the Furbish, you're going to stop a dam for a Furbish lousewort? So that you can understand, I think, why this becomes so controversial. That we're talking about species that are trivial in many ways, but the idea, and then there was the American burying beetle. Yeah. So what has happened is that the flagfish, the flagship things, the bald eagles and peregrine falcons and all of that, aren't what it really has mostly been about. And the good news is that since the Europeans arrived in North America, as far as we know, we've lost only 4 species. Only 4. They are the Carolina parakeet, the ivory-billed woodpecker, the passenger pigeon, and the little warbler, whose name I'm forgetting right at the moment. But only 4 species. And ironically, it's interesting that what happened, and this was before the Endangered Species Act, the Carolina parakeet was common in southeastern U.S. It was just shot out, totally decimated, because it wreaked havoc in the peach orchards and other orchards. It ate fruit, and so it was killed out. The passenger pigeon was the most abundant bird in North America when Europeans arrived. It is generally believed that at that time, about every other land bird in North America was a passenger pigeon. That is, half of all land birds in North America were passenger pigeons. And they bred all over the eastern, and the flocks blackened the sky for hours. Audubon had these descriptions. It was unbelievably abundant bird. The last one died in 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. How were we able to exterminate the most abundant bird in North America? Because it gathered in dense colonies to breed. And even when it got rarer and rarer and rarer, usually it was no longer profitable, you could still find it because they got together in dense. And there was an incredible market for squabs. And so there's a market, and you could take them all the way down. The ivory-billed woodpecker, it's habitat loss. It's a bird of the forests, the bottomland forests of the southeast and lower Mississippi Valley, and we just logged it all off. And you may have remembered that not too long ago there was a report that there have always been reports. I've seen some of the pictures. I've been asked to evaluate them. Is that really a ivory-billed woodpecker flying? Because it's really quite distinctive. It's the biggest woodpecker in North America, and there are pictures sometimes of poor ones of them flying. But there was a report that seemed to be credible, and everything stopped. Nature Conservancy tries to buy a lot of land, and you may have seen one of the videos on this, a little town there that became the ivory-billed woodpecker town, and people came to see it, and there was hope maybe it was still surviving, but it turns out it was a lovely video. It's worth seeing about this town. Became, you want to come see ivory? Here we come. Here we're the ivory-billed woodpecker town, and a lot of people came, and a lot of people wanted to see it. It was a spectacular bird. But that has turned out not to be the case, and it has been formally declared as extinct. So only 4. Dozens have gone extinct in the Hawaiian Islands, because there it's an interesting story. And islands in general are, as one person have said, islands are places where species go to die. And what happened in the Hawaiian Islands is that they were all rare birds with small ranges because there's not very many big places there. And they were being wiped out by habitat loss and everything. So there was a little program that was in the schools in the Hawaiian Islands. Bring in your pennies and dimes, and we're going to bring in import birds. To make up for the stuff we've lost. And so it was like a march of dimes for birds. And so they brought in, and if you go to the Honolulu lowlands now, almost every bird you see is brought in from somewhere. Cardinals from South America, white-eyes, they're all non-native birds. Well, one of the things that happened is that all those birds brought in avian malaria. And avian malaria was not present in Hawaii, and the birds had no resistance to avian malaria. And so all native birds, up to the point of view where the mosquitoes wouldn't go, were wiped out. And so that they're very susceptible. And this is, and the other place is Guam, where a brown tree snake from Australia came in on some baggage in airplanes and got loose and just ran rampant. Had a bunch of birds, had no experience with a snake. There were no snakes in Guam. There are no predators on snakes in Guam. So the brown snake became unbelievably abundant, and just has wiped out the land birds of Guam. So So there are places, things with small ranges and islands like that, where suddenly a new system, bunch of events happens that make them extremely vulnerable. It can happen, but on a big place like North America, so as we know, a lot of them are plummeting in population now, going down, 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 and we're worried about a lot of them. But so far, 4. We're lucky. We're very lucky 4. And but there's a lot more that looks like it's about to come. So it's a complicated problem, and sometimes it's a habitat that has to be preserved. Sometimes it's just you got to stop shooting them. But that's what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to help us figure out. But the Endangered Species Act is also an ethical statement. It basically says, nice people don't cause other species to become extinct when you could not avoid doing it. Just like nice people don't sell grandma's teeth, okay? So it's an ethical statement, but ethical statements are very interesting because ethical statements don't have right or wrong answers, okay? They got a current one that's dividing the U.S. now. Is it women's right to control her reproduction or murder? That's the debate, talking past one another. And there is no right or wrong answer to that. It's how public vision moves. And in the Spotted Owl case, I got to know the attorney who was arguing against me, and offline, you talk. Everybody knows what the game is all about. She could honestly not understand why you would not log those marvelous trees and all the stuff you could build with that because there was an owl there. She genuinely couldn't understand it, and I couldn't tell her that she was wrong. I couldn't. I listened to her. I understood her, and she was genuine, and I couldn't tell her she was wrong. But nonetheless, ethical issues are extremely important. But it's interesting, the ethics of the Endangered Species Act is at a population. The ethics is not to allow a species to go extinct. So the level is at the population or species but the people for the ethical treatment of animals, it's the individual. It's only the individual that matters. And here's how it plays out in the Endangered Species Act. One of the most endangered birds in North America is the Kirtland's warbler that breeds in jack pine forests in central Michigan on really awful sandy soils, and it's area that burns a lot in the young growth of the young pines. And the Kirtland warbler breeds their nests on the ground, and that's the only habitat it was. And what was happening is that what was endangering it was not loss of habitat, but another bird, the brown-headed cowbird, one of my beloved blackbirds, okay? The brown-headed cowbird is a brood parasite. It lays its eggs in the nests of other birds and lets the foster parents raise them. And the brown-headed cowbird loves what we've done in North America. It's widespread. We've got cattle all over the place. The brown-headed cowbird is an abundant bird all over North America. But it was likely to cause the extinction of the Kirtland's warbler. So what did we do? We authorized killing of brown-headed cowbirds. And so traps were set and the brown-headed cowbirds were killed there. The people for the ethical treatment of animals thought this is terrible. A brown-headed cowbird is worth the same as the individual life as the Kirtland's warbler. And again, are they wrong? But it's even more extreme. Some rats have gotten on some of the Pacific Islands where endangered seabirds are breeding, and the rats just wipe them out. And rat poisoning programs, but the people for the ethical treatment of animals, those rats got every right to live too. So the ethical issue in the Endangered Species Act, as you might expect, I was in favor of getting rid of the cowbirds, even though I love blackbirds. But I didn't think it was a good idea to let the Kirtland's warbler go extinct, which it probably would have if we hadn't done something about the cowbirds. I don't like to kill cowbirds. I really don't. But faced with, do I want to let the Kirtland's warbler likely to become extinct, or am I willing to sacrifice some cowbirds? And my ethical judgment is, cowbirds are abundant everywhere. As a result of the Kirtland's warbler has actually expanded. There's some now breeding in jack pine forests in Wisconsin, and a couple. So it is in Ontario, and it's spread a little bit. Almost certainly, it would have gone extinct if we hadn't done something about the cowbird. So again, ethical at what level? And the ethics of the Endangered Species Act is at the population level. And we don't want to let a population go extinct. And if we have to sacrifice some other individuals of other species, that's a part of it. But again, I can't tell the people of the ethical, PETA, no, it's wrong to, you're wrong to think that cowbirds aren't worth saving. There's no answer to those. That's how public opinion goes. And that's the nature of all these ethical arguments and why they're so bitter, because there is no answer and how public opinion changes. And I think basically, and this will play out again when we come back to the spotted owl at the end, okay? So these are some of the complicated things that are involved with the ethical aspect of the endangered. But it's important. It says nice people don't cause species to go extinct. But why? What good is a Kirtland's warbler? These are ethical issues that don't have simple answers. But there's another aspect of this. For an awful lot of species that we're considering listing, it's land. Species require space and require land, and so you designate the habitat, the critical habitat for the species that are part of listing, and you got to preserve that habitat. You can't drain the pop hole, but this creates a real dilemma. And so I own forest land in western Washington, and I know that the spotted owl is being listed. And if they find a spotted owl on my land, all sorts of constraints. So what am I going to do? I hire somebody to go out. If they can find a spotted owl, shoot it. So it's a shoot, shovel, and shut up. And then if they come along, oh, I don't have any spotted owls. And so this is a real problem. And I'm describing something which really happens. The shoot, shovel, and shut up is a real thing. And it's understandable. Okay? And particularly if I'm a landowner and I got some wonderful trees there and I like to harvest them and there's this owl? I'm not going to do that because of the owl? Let's get rid of it. So, what do you do? I mean, this is a real problem. And Bruce Babbitt, who was the Secretary of the Interior, was very imaginative in trying to figure out what do we do? Can we find some ways? And he developed a safe harbor agreement. And you work with some landowner, and yes, I'll work with you, and you'll bring the habitat, help improve the habitat for some endangered species that, if we do it right, can be on your land. But if you agree to that and we get the endangered species back, I'm not going to slap you with new restrictions. That's the only way to get the person to agree to it. If I do it and I bring back the endangered species, and then you slap me with this new stuff, I'm not going to cooperate. I'm not going to do that. And so the safe harbors group, and this worked well with the bird that was in the southeastern U.S. along there. You had magnificent longleaf pine forests. They were gorgeous pine forests, open, burnt regularly, and they were incredible. But they've been cut down, and one of the birds that lives in those pine forests and has become endangered is the red cockaded woodpecker. And it builds nest holes in those pines. That's the only place it is, and it's very rare. And so, to work, what Babbitt got people to do was work. I'm going to help you, and we're going to work together to bring back the habitat so the red cockaded woodpecker will come back. But if the red cockaded woodpecker comes back, I'm not going to slap new restrictions on you. That's the only way to get it to work. So these sort of things, how to change the incentive structure, because the incentive structure for shoot, shovel, and shut up is very clear. There's no reason why. Every reason why, and I have to confess, if I owned a lot of land and forest land, and I'd be tempted. I really would, because the economics at stake is really enormous. So this lets you know whenever the land, and this is a part of a recovery plan, identifying critical habitat. That's what a good, if it is critical habitat, which isn't always the case, but sometimes it is, this becomes then a very contentious thing. And there's always competing uses for land that are economically viable, and they're worth a lot more money than an owl there. Okay, so these are some of the complications that come with the administration of the Endangered Species Act. And to show you and illustrate how complicated and difficult and tortuous this can become, let's go back to the northern spotted owl. That's one there. The spotted owl has 3 subspecies. The northern spotted owl, which is the one about which the litigation is happening, which did run from southern British Columbia down along these coastal forests. These magnificent conifer forests, which until Europeans came, blanketed this landscape, the most magnificent conifer forests in the world. He's not in a conifer forest, but they also get in other stuff. Sorry that it's not in a conifer, okay. Sorry, Jane. But this was the dominant, this forest, there were occasional fires, little landslides, but it was the dominant thing over the whole landscape. And a bird adapted for life inside that forest, hunting things inside the forest. That's all it became a specialist, and particularly a specialist on another animal that's really lives especially in that forest, the flying squirrel. So the spotted owls the northern spotted owls living primarily on flying squirrels, which are also dependent upon this. So it was adapted to a magnificent conifer forest, which dominated the landscape, and that was all that it have to deal with. Then the other subspecies of population is the California spotted owl, which is in the Sierra Nevada and various places, and it's a fairly different sort of environment. And then the third is the Mexican spotted owl, which is from the southern Rockies down through the mountains of Mexico. So these are 3 identifiable populations. They're under the Endangered Species Act definition. They're all species. Okay. So, but the only one that was involved was the northern spotted owl. Well, that's where all the litigation is about, and it is one that lived and evolved in this environment where it was all just this magnificent conifer forest. So, but the first suit in which I was involved was brought not under the Endangered Species Act. The owl had not yet been listed. The Forest Practices Management Act. And the Forest Practices Management Act stated that the Forest Service had the responsibility to maintain viable populations of all the vertebrates in the forest. So, what happens? And it turns out that here's the indicator of old growth forest is spotted owl. I would have thought the best indicator of old growth forest was big trees. But the Forest Service had no mandate to keep big trees. But it did have a mandate to preserve the spotted owl. So there was a court case, and we all knew it wasn't about the owl, that the owl was the handle, the legal handle. We all knew it was about stopping the logging of old growth forests. That was what this thing was about. And the only handle we had was the owl. So this is a crazy thing. I was there in court, and we all were pretending it was the owl, and we knew it wasn't. The owl was a legal handle. So that's the first of these things. It's interesting, the judge that ruled in the owl's favor was a Reagan appointee, and it was a law and order decision. He said, you have this responsibility, and you're not carrying it out. Do it. But he also, it was a wonderful law and order decision, but he also showed his emotions in an offside thing. He said, you know, the richest country in the world can afford to save a little land for other things. So he had his ethical statement there, but his ruling was an entirely a law and order ruling. But then the owl was listed, and it became then the legal thing that it was, and other things. But then some interesting things happened. There's another species of the same genus, a little bigger, called the barred owl. And the barred owl is an abundant common bird all over eastern North America in the deciduous and conifer forests, going up into the aspen parklands. And the barred owl has the most wonderful call of any owl you've ever heard. Woo, 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 woo. If you hear it, it's the spotted owl just goes, but the barred owl is this marvelous thing. But the barred owl, it turns out, with all of the planting of trees along the northern Great Plains and creating habitat, the barred owls moved and got into northern British Columbia. And then they just spread south. And they're now down as far as California. They're breeding in Seattle. And the barred owl, which is just not a conifer-related old growth bird, it's much more adaptable. They show up. They can't stay in Freeway Park because there's not enough place. But they come around a while and dine on rats, which there are plenty of in Freeway Park. But the barred owl is breeding in Seattle, and it's breeding. But it is a competitor for the spotted owl. And also, being a bigger, it's dominant. And at first, when they were first male, there was some hybridization, the male barred owls mating with female. But that quickly ended because there's plenty of female barred owls. Lots of barred owls are very, very common. And hybridization very quickly quit. But the barred owl is dominant and drives out the spotted owl. So what do? An effort then is let's try to control barred owls. And so there's a campaign now of shooting barred owls. And the Nature Conservancy, out of face with the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to come on Nature Conservancy land and shoot barred owls. And I was involved in the decision of what do we do about this, because we didn't have a policy. And we agreed that we could support it if it were a one-time only. But if if you had reason to believe that you got rid of it once and you didn't have to do it again, we'd agree to it as a one-time, but not if it has to be continuous. And of course, what it has to be is continuous. The barred owls keep reproducing. They're doing very well, and they're having to go out now, and they're trying to just shoot barred owls. And this was something you'd have to keep doing forever, because barred owls are very successful at reproducing. There are a lot of them, and you would have to keep it on forever. And this is where now I come down on this, that there was what was called the triage during the First World War with the medicine people. You put people into three categories: those that were going to get well, whether you did anything or not; those that were going to die and you couldn't do anything about to save them; and these are the ones you might help, and you should put your effort there. And so, in some ways, in looking at overall, I haven't talked about this, but one of the things in endangered species stuff is triage thinking. If we got limited effort to put on stuff, let's look at the ones we could really do something about. And I've come to the conclusion, with respect to the northern spotted owl, it's triage. I'm not in favor of continuing to shoot barred owls, and this almost certainly means that the northern spotted owl will disappear. I don't see how it could last. So that's a tough decision, but again, that's something that I'm not willing to try to save the northern spotted owl, which was adapted to an environment which we've utterly destroyed and aren't going to come back. And I'm not willing to save at the price of continuing to murder barred owls. I just won't do it. But I can't tell the people that are for shooting barred owls that it's wrong. Okay, these are ethical issues. They don't have right and wrong answers. I've given you mine, but I can understand people who figure we've got to shoot these barred owls. But, so this is the twist that has gone on now. What has happened now? The spread of the barred owl is almost certainly related to stuff we've done to North America, enabling them to get across what is the barrier into northern British Columbia. And we've created in this area not this vast expanse of old growth forest, but a medley of all sorts of middle stuff and all. And the barred owls love it. The spotted owls don't. And so I'm willing to say the barred owl is now the ones that adapted to this environment we've created, and let's not go to all these efforts to try to save the northern spotted owl, because we also have the California spotted owl and the Southern Rockies Mexican spotted owl, which is isolated. It's in the process. It's going to become another species. Give it time, because there's no genetic exchange, right? Living in a total different environment. It's not dependent on flying squirrels. It's going to evolve, and the species at that level will survive. But these are the triage kind of. Who would have expected when we first started dealing with the spotted owl in the forests that the whole thing would be upended by the invasion of a closely related owl that's a little bigger and dominant to it, that is better adapted to the environment we've now created. So, but these are the tough moral decisions. I can understand people think we ought to shoot barred owls. I just don't happen to agree, but I can't tell them that they're wrong. So you can see that I've had, this has been also a personal odyssey for me. I've been involved in this. I've been in court several times in favor of the owl, and this is, as Aldo Leopold said, the first rule of intelligent tinkering is save all the pieces. And we're doing very unintelligent tinkering. We're not saving the pieces, and we don't know what they do, and we don't know the consequences of it. And so I've been in this game very, very deeply emotionally to try to see, can we do something to help maintain enough of the biological diversity of the planet as we go through this awful thing we're going now, that what we will need to do to recover is not all that terrible. And so in the morning, when I look at the mirror and I comb what remains of my hair, and I look and think of my kids and grandkids and other things, and I say to myself, I really tried. I really tried. Thank you. I'm all wired here.
We have people in each section. In fact, Sally, get up and go that way. And
Gordon,
Yes.
who is responsible for counting and letting us know that there's a species that is endangered?
Well, that's often part of the problem. It depends. Well, the desert pupfish, we know there's in this one spot. We know how many are there. But with something, American burying beetle or something like that, getting numbers, figuring out how many there are of these things, that's something that the entities that demand, or the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to list, it has to try to do that, to figure out what do we know about how many there are and where they are. And this is a lot more difficult than you might originally think. I mean, counting stuff out there. And so we often have very incomplete information. And that often, what the debate is about. Oh, you think it's endangered, but there are a lot more. And this is, the book I quoted was Melville's Mistake. And Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, knew, and Moby Dick was a sperm whale. And that's, Melville knew everything about whales. He was an expert on whales. And he picked the right one. The sperm whale is the only one of the big whales that actually has big jaws. All the other big ones are ones that are filter feeding, and they wouldn't knock anybody over. This one, the sperm whale, feeds on giant squid. It goes down to the deep depth, and it has battles with a giant squid. And it is the only whale out there that could possibly do what he made Moby Dick do. But Melville's Mistake, which is the title of this book by Michael Bean, one of the leaders in this, is he thought there was somewhere else. As these whales were disappearing, they were somewhere else, weren't they? And now we know there ain't nowhere else. But it's tough counting. Yes.
Gordon, I'm very moved by your account of your experience, but in terms of the actual battle going on to save the old growth forest, which was what the spotted owl really was all about, was there any success? In other words, over all these years of litigation, did the spotted owl, in fact, save any old growth forest? There's not much left. And if it does disappear, will the last of the old growth go?
Very good question, because, the idea was that the spotted owl was going to, but there has been, in general, over most of the forests, the National Forest Service has agreed that no longer to cut old growth. the most important exception is the Tongass in Africa, where in Alaska, where they're still cutting old growth. But the point is, there's almost nothing left, but there is in general now a feeling that old growth, what's little bit is left, should be left, and we're also thinking about the possibility: can we regrow some of it? But we have now a short cutting cycle every 6 to 80 years, and you will never ever with that recreate anything like old growth. So we have to have a totally new philosophy about forestry with longer rotations and allowing some stuff that is now second growth to become old growth. So there has been progress, and the loss of the owl up there because is no longer the impediment. But it's a tough road because we have almost nothing left, and the whole way we do forestry is you don't generate old growth. Are we speechless? Careful,
just for
careful,
fun.
careful, I'll start
I have
talking
a
again.
question.
I was going to.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Sally.
What about the starling? You know, we used to say the starling birds were going to take over.
Yeah, okay. Well, a lot of the problem that we have with species outcompeting other species or causing real trouble are things that are introduced to places where they weren't before. And they often come without their native enemies, you know, that they can be pathogen free, and the native species don't have anything against them. So the starling was one of these that brought in from Europe and introduced into Central Park, New York. And the reason for this, believe it or not, is that the Brits believed that every place in the world ought to have all the species mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. I kid you not. I kid you not. And they had to go twice. And that's how we have house sparrows and some other stuff too, that they were in Shakespeare's plays. But the starling then is a hole nester. And the problem is that it was holes are in short supply in our forests because we don't get things old and scraggly and get holes in them. And so when we manage forests, there's a shortage of holes. And the starlings were competing with other things for holes, and they weren't having any diseases. And so starlings got amazingly abundant. The populations are coming down now because the diseases are picking up. And we've also learned how to develop. One of the species that was hit hardest by the starlings were bluebirds, which are also hole nesters. And we've figured out that the bluebird's a little smaller, and you could design a box with an opening just big enough that the bluebird can get in and the starling can't. And that's what. And if you go to places in eastern Washington now, there are big areas with hundreds of bluebird boxes, and a lot of bluebirds are coming in. The starlings can't use them. So, but a major problem, and a lot of the birds that are in trouble are hole nesting, because the way we manage these wonderful forests and we don't allow things to get scraggly and have holes in and all. We don't like that. That's messy. And a lot of we do have, but a lot of the species that nest in holes don't make their own holes. Like bluebirds, they require somebody else to have made it. But the starlings are back down, and they're getting, and we've learned how to favor other things. But the starlings are still doing extremely well and abundantly. But again, as in the case of Hawaii, where you brought in a thing not native, most of the problems where species are causing difficulties for other species is where they've been introduced in areas where they weren't before. And that's why one of the things we try to have as policies, let's stop the introductions of all these things, because Not all of them do, but some of them are going to create a mess. Yeah.
Gordon, this has been interesting, as it always is.
Thank
I
you.
wonder, before there were governments and regulations and agencies and people concerned about this, nature kind of took care of this. As the species would die out and other ones would start up. Has the intervention of man and the regulatory process really improved things, do you think, in
Well-
the long run? Or should we just trust to nature?
Well, we have to trust a lot in nature because we're pretty bad managers. But I had intended to talk a little bit about what some other cultures do, but I was running out of time. But obviously, other cultures, like our Pacific Northwest ones, had no notion of evolution and no notion that we're sharing 90%, 97% of genes with chimps. You know, but they had some sense of relationships, and they considered these. We had the clan of the bear, the clan of the wolf, or the clan of the raven. So these clans, they were all related, and they considered, and the clan of the bison, an area where I've been working, where the bison were brothers, and this created really interesting cognitive problems, because bison are our brothers, but we depend upon for our system on killing them. So you go through these special problems, and in the Pacific Northwest here, you went through a special performance with a bear. You talk to the bear, and there's only one way you could go out and kill a bear, is if the bear had agreed to give it to you, self to you. So you went in, and the bear gives it to you, and then you go and are able to kill it and eat it. So these societies had recognitions, but what saved the bison is not that they had some great conservation ethic. That until there were horses, there's only one way you could kill them: run them off a cliff. And so we had these bison jumps in various places. But you remember until the Spaniards brought horses. Everywhere in North America, Central and South America, if you went anywhere, you walked. You walked. There was nothing you could ride. And so the reason, the minute they got horses and there was a market for buffalo hides, the Indians started slaughtering them like crazy. So part of the ethic there is that inability to do much more damage that then partly saved it, rather than some great ethical thing that we sometimes, because I could see it in the northern Great Plains. The minute there was and buffalo hide had a market in Europe, massive market in Europe, and the Indians, Fort Benton was the big trading post there. Eastern Montana, the farthest seaport from the ocean in the United States, and you could load bison hides there and ship them down to New Orleans. And there was a market, and the Indians, they know what a market is when they got in. They had horses and they could do it, and the Indians were in on the slaughter. Even though, the history of the reason we slaughtered the bison was to starve out the Indians. So, I mean, there's a complex history here, but a lot of the notions of the environmental sensitivity, you can see it was there because of an inability to do more, other than some great ethical awareness, I think, and we can, I've seen it, because I've worked a lot on Northern Great Plains now, and I've seen what happens when, don't let there be a market, because that changes everything,
Until this moment, you have been almost entirely on birds, which is understandable, but the way in which we mostly see in the newspapers, it's wolves, or the introduction of grizzly bears into the Northern Cascades. What does that kind of public controversy do for the law and for the animals?
Well, with wolves and bears, the controversy is that because they're dangerous. I mean, there's no example I know of a wolf killing a person in North America, but they kill stuff we like. So the wolves are seeing a threat. Hunters don't want the wolves because, well, they also think wolves do all sorts of dastardly things they don't do. But bears, grizzly bears, do kill people, and they can be dangerous. And there, some of the environmental people have been opposed to bringing grizzlies into the North Cascades because I can no longer walk in peace. I got to worry about because the grizzly. And I've hiked in Alaska in grizzly country, and you got to be careful because they are very dangerous. And if you confront them, they may consider you something that would be very good for dinner. So, but these animals, which have protection under the Endangered Species Act, have special stuff because they're dangerous to things we care about. It's interesting that the people who I work with in Montana, when they're trying to figure out how to do ranching when we're going to bring back wolves and grizzlies, where did they go to figure out how to do it? They went to East Africa to talk to the Maasai. The Maasai are ranching cattle and sheep and goats in an area full of the most formidable array of predators anywhere on Earth. How did they do it? So the people I know in Montana went to East Africa and talked to the Maasai. And that's what we do now. You keep them moving. You have somebody riding with them. If you can't get them at a safe place at night, you do that. So, but the problem, things that are really dangerous. I mean, the Furbished Loutworth isn't going to hurt anybody, or the pupfish isn't going to. But these big predators, and these are the ones, of course, which the traditional societies have all the stuff about, because they're dangerous. And you're going to go out hunting them, and this is going to be dangerous. So, but they pose extra problems because they are in fact dangerous.
Thank you. Sally, can you get a mic to Mike? And then we'll have one more after that, I think, and then thank you all.
Just a quick question about this pythons in Florida eating everything. How would you stop the pythons?
Well, again, the pythons are there because for some reason or other, people like to keep snakes as pets. And when you got a python, they tend to get big. And they get too big and you don't want it anymore, so you let it loose. And that's how they got out there. And the python there, again, has no predators there. And it's just spreading, and it's eating everything up. And there was a classic thing where you had this battle between an alligator and the python, and they battled and they both died, as I remember from this. But nobody knows what to do about that snake. There's a bounty on it, but snakes have very high reproductive rates, and as far as I can tell, we're going to have to live with the python and the Everglades, and I don't see how we're going to get rid of it. And I wish we could, because it's eating up all the middle-sized stuff too, the raccoons and everything else. The big predators eat middle-sized predators. Like what happened when wolves got into Yellowstone? What is one of the things that took it on the chin? Coyotes. And it was not just that they competed with them; they ate them. Don't keep snakes as pets. And if you got to get rid of it, take it to the zoo. But I don't see how we're going to get rid of the python in the Everglades. And there's a tegu, a big lizard from South America, that's also running rampant. Again, there are no natural predators there. The python in Africa has predators. They're things that eat pythons. And they're careful. They stay hidden during the day and looking out at night. And there are eagles and stuff that eat them. So again, we've introduced them to a place where there's no predators, and there they go. Yes.
One element I believe is part of the endangered species is got to do with how all species interrelate within one kind of ecological zone. Could you talk a bit about the interrelatedness and the balance of like predator versus prey and multiple species up and down the food chain that live within different or individual ecological zones?
Do you have another hour? I mean, I don't mean to just be flip, but the Endangered Species Act is species-oriented, but it also says the habitat, you have to designate critical habitat, and the critical habitat also says something about who else is there. So that it does get in, but it gets in very marginally. And when we get into this whole business of, that's why, you know, intelligent tinkering means save all the species. We don't know species. We don't know what all those species do. We don't know, and we don't have any idea whether the forest without a spotted owl is really different than one with. I can't tell you that. We don't know. Maybe it is, but we're never going to get a chance to know because we got the barred owl there instead, and it's sort of taking its place. So we'll never get to really look at that question. But it's hard to know. And you really can't base the Endangered Species Act on going too far in that because it gets so complicated and you don't know what's going on. That doesn't mean it isn't really important, but it's enough to handle with the species itself and the environment you're going to need to prevent the threat. And you got to be satisfied because even the counting just how many stuff is there, as we talked about earlier, you know, this is really hard. You might think it's easy to know how many spotted owls or things are out there, but that's devilishly difficult. That's really hard. And so we have a lot of incomplete information.
Well, thank you, Gordon.